I determined that it is in the national security interests of the United States to respond to the Assad regime's use of chemical weapons through a targeted military strike.
Welcome back. We are discussing the foreign policy legacy of outgoing US President Barack Obama. Let's get back to our panel. PJ Crowley, your new book's going to be called Red Line. He was talking about a red line, the use of chemical weapons, but that strike never happened. Big failure of the Obama policy?
Well, I think that the Obama administration did achieve a notable success. The removal of most chemical weapons, obviously chlorine bombs, have continued to be a challenge in Syria.
A last-minute deal with Moscow, yeah.
Yeah, but obviously the management of that process, did create international questions about the credibility of American power. So I think he did the right thing, perhaps not necessarily in the wrong way. I do want to say back to Hamoud. I think that we talk about Syria as if it's one conflict. I think there are 10 sides to the Syrian conflict. I think the president's instincts about being measured about what the United States can do, I think is right. I think if the United States or the Obama administration, probably miscalculated, it was first they thought that Assad, would go the way of Gaddafi. Obviously, he's still there.
And most others in the region.
Yeah. And I think that we just have to recognize that this is going to be a generational struggle. If we want to criticize the Obama administration for not solving it in their 5 or 6 years, this is going to be something that bedevils the next president and the president after that.
Jim, I want to bring you in. The red line, obviously, you think that was a turning point for allies and adversaries to look at the Obama presidency, but it was also a beginning of a sort of dance with Russia on the international stage as well, which still isn't quite over.
That's right, and the Russians have thrown us lifeline after lifeline when it comes to Syria, and we keep trying to game them, saying, okay, fine, but at the end of the day, Assad must go, which simply is not going to...
the conflict's not going to end unless he does.
No, quite to the contrary. The conflict will end when the terrorists are defeated.
I mean,
and because he's not going to go, and that's the whole point we have to start to accept. Look, let's remember what happened. As I say, Obama read from his teleprompter, red line, blah, blah, a line he should not have drawn. The British Parliament unexpectedly voted down their participation in this, and that is what then spurred on, right, left, and center of the United States, a huge outpouring of opposition to the Congress, and Obama was then smart enough to take it out, which is to say, well, let the Congress decide, and then Vladimir threw him a lifeline to say, let's get the weapons out of there. Suppose he'd followed through with his red line. At best, we'd see the kind of chaos we see in Libya, or more likely, we'd see the black flag of Daesh or Al-Qaeda or somebody flying over Damascus, another job well done.
Well, there has been an accusation from Republicans that Obama has led from behind, and, and Russia features quite heavily in this.
That's right.
Is that, okay, it started with Libya, with the backing of the NATO campaign, but not essentially leading the NATO campaign. But we've seen, some people say, a backseat in Syria as well, and a tacit acknowledgement of Russian involvement.
That's right, and that's why I disagree with the, if you want to call it the mainstream of Republican opinion, which is essentially neoconservatism. It's Bush-era neoconservatism, that there is only one fault with American power, never using enough of it. And I think that's a mistake. The idea that we get to decide who should be the leaders of other countries, overthrow them at will, I think is bad strategically for the United States.
So tolerate, the U.S. should tolerate spheres of influence, for example, like Ukraine,
absolutely,
Crimea.
Absolutely. Spheres of influence are absolutely, let's look at the most stable period of European politics in the 19th century under the concert of powers. There was a recognition that you don't step on other powers' toes gratuitously. We don't respect that anymore. We think our spear goes right up to the territorial waters of every other country in the world. It's a mistake.
Although the struggle for mastery in Europe did have quite a few localized wars, but we could, that's another
localized
show.
Wars, they happen.
Okay.
They do.
Hamoud, is there a power vacuum now in the Middle East being filled by powers other than the US, including Russia? And of course, China has growing economic clout and interests in the region as well. Are we seeing a step back, do you think, from the US's post-World War II globalized role with the Obama administration?
Well, there are those who would argue that there is not a setback, but it's change of strategy, a shift in type of engagement those who argue that Obama or President Obama is not engaged in the Middle East conflict say that because of the circumstances that emerged with the Arab Spring, that there is a sense that doing or trying to get a balance act between the American domestic fatigue and the geopolitical consideration or changes required for President Obama to take a different approach, which is relying on surrogates in the region, relying on Saudi Arabia, on Qatar, or non-state actors to achieve what amount to not a bigger threat to American national interests. So certainly with that approach, we have had a vacuum where we have the emergence of the Iranians as a regional power threatening the Gulf or perceived to be a threat to the Gulf countries, particularly in Bahrain, particularly in Yemen. And Saudis are very concerned about that. You also have non-state actors, the Daesh organizations, who seems to be having some kind of influence in the region. So in many ways, the American presence is seen in different ways. The wars using drones, the idea that we should rely on surrogates in the region has also had its consequences because of a feeling that the region feels that the United States is not doing what is expected to be doing. And more than anything else, it continues to be seen as a problem, not a solution to the conflict. And more than anything else, today, when we rely heavily on the surrogates, like the Qataris, the Saudis, there is also a fearing that the United States may not be that dependable of an ally. So the vacuum is certainly there, but it's also, we have to understand, we have to look at the geostrategic changes, and we have to look at it from that perspective. It's not that simple to judge President Obama on just the fact of what's happening.
PJ, Middle East obviously dominating a lot of Obama foreign policy, but it was meant to be a little bit different, wasn't it? The pivot, the rebalance to Asia was very much a centerpiece of the administration's policy. Did the Middle East sort of pull them away from that? Or do you think when it comes to the rebalance, they're pretty much on track? And
well, I mean, there is a pivot. It's ongoing. It's in its early stages. And it's going to be something that I think the next president's going to pick up one way or the other. I think the calculation of the administration was that we will pivot to Asia, and we were overinvested in the Middle East. And then again, the Middle East, as we've been talking about, has been pulling us back in. You know, I mean, as the only genuine global power, we can do more than one thing at the same time. So I think perhaps maybe it was a challenge of presentation, the idea that a pivot means we'll do less here, less there. You know, the answer is we're going to be significantly engaged in the Asia-Pacific region. We're dealing with a generational struggle, a transformation in the Middle East that's going to be going on for the next 50 years. And then, oh, by the way, you know, we just spent the last, you know, couple of years, you know, talking about the classic mission of NATO, Article 5. Yeah. And the reality is this is what you get in the White House. You're going to have to do meaningful work in all elements of the world at one point or another.
But can the U.S. do everything? I mean, and let's just focus on Asia, because the rebalance was meant to be diplomatic, militarily, and trade. And there has been a feeling in the region, rightly or wrongly, that perhaps they don't quite know allies of the U.S., how far the U.S. will come to back them up. There's also a feeling in Beijing, let's face it, sorry, just let me finish this point, that the pivot or the rebalance is basically a contained China policy.
That's certainly how China feels.
Well, that's an important, I mean, given the number two.
No, but actually, you know, if part of the rationale behind the pivot was for understandable reasons, that because, you know, the Bush administration was focused on the aftermath of 9/11, Afghanistan, and Iraq, you know, it had paid less attention to the Asia-Pacific region. You know, that was part of the purpose of the pivot, and I would argue that today, U.S. relations with its traditional allies in the region are strong and are going to get stronger. A lot of that has evolved around challenges in the South China Sea, you know, the EC, but you know, without taking sides on how on the final resolution of various boundary disputes, The United States has been clear in saying that these should be resolved through international means, and while reinforcing the importance of freedom of navigation. And I think the United States' response to these flashpoints has really deepened the level of cooperation and support that the region feels from the United States.
Jim, what do you feel about the rebalance station?
I think it's as misguided as the rest of Obama's policy.
Why?
Look, because it suffers from the same defect as we do not have a clear sense of what's in it for the United States. Do we have a dog in this fight? Let's take South China Sea. Let's take South China Sea. Which part of China do we not understand here? We say we have allies, interests to protect. You normally have allies to help you protect your interest. The only interest we have in the region is protecting our allies' interests. It's a complete self-licking ice cream cone. If there was a dispute we had in the Caribbean with Mexico or Cuba, whoever, do you think the Chinese would give a damn about what we did to secure our interests? No. They would say we don't have a dog in that fight. That should be our position in the South China Sea. I relate to something else that was said earlier about using surrogates. I sometimes feel that we're the surrogate. That, for example, take Saudi Arabia, who spends a lot of money in this town and peddles a lot of influence. Is there any group of terrorists in any regional conflict connected to Saudi Arabia and inspired by Wahhabism we haven't gotten into bed with? And I feel that with the lack of national interest-based foreign policy, we end up carrying other people's water for them.
Jim is a solid 19th century kind of guy.
But there is that feeling in this
I'm more of a 9th century kind of guy.
Sorry, we have to finish the show in a minute. But last point, but there is this feeling as we go out of the Obama administration that perhaps a little bit of isolationism, a little bit of stepping back, we see it with the rise of the man who will not be named on the show.
I call it realism. Realism is what I would call it.
But I mean, back to the question of interest. Look, the United States has fought multiple wars in Asia. It has an interest in peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula. It has a security treaty, with Japan. Much of its economy is rooted in the Asia-Pacific region. Most of the history of the 21st century will be written in the Asia-Pacific region. So I disagree with Jim that we don't have an interest here, and we should let those who, and we are an Asia-Pacific country. So, I think that clearly over 8 years, we have strengthened our engagement in the Asia-Pacific region. Our allies, our friends welcome the attention that we've given to it, and we've seen meaningful results.
I wish we could go on further, and of course we didn't talk too much about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, of course, which is the third leg of the stool, the economic negotiations, which of course are in peril now here in this town in Washington. Thanks so much for joining us. A great panel indeed. I wish we could have longer.